right. Good afternoon, good evening. Happy to see you again, Amphitheater 1 of the Rencontre d'Aix. So thank you, Jean-Hervé, for organizing this amazing meeting. Thank you, Laurence BOONE. You're the representative of the Cercle des économistes, former State Secretary to European Affairs. Thank you, Sébastien LECORNU, Minister of Armed of Defense, to be with us tonight for this roundtable. The title is rather crucial. What sovereignties in a fragmented world? Economic, industrial, political sovereignty. Laurence BOONE will kick off the discussion. Thank you. Thank you to the Parliament. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for playing the game with us. So I'll discuss sovereignty. For our security, it has to go through Europe, and therefore we'll be able to have a larger discussion. We talk about defense because sovereignty is the ability to finance choices and to ensure security, homeland security. We could have a quick comparison on about expenditure. The budget of defense in the US is $1 trillion. And in Europe is 300 billion euros. So therefore, Europe spends a lot of money in foreign countries, but in defense, Europe imports about 80% of its military material from non-European countries, 80% thereof from the US. So it's a kind of a compromise from post-wars to ensure, we used to buy that to ensure production. Less than 20% of European purchasing are done together, and usually it's a small group of countries and not to buy in Europe. Sorry. So first thing, so our expenditures are fragmented and not up to scale. Production. Europe has a 1.4 million armed force, but it is divided into 27 countries, which make them smaller nano armies. Europe produces as much as the US, but exports more than half of its production. And as the production is fragmented, we do have redundancy and redundant aspect and some elements which are missing. Some industries are over-concentrated in small states and they're in competition because no industry is ready to hand over or to lose sovereignty. So European has 62 platforms, and it's 6 in the US rather than 47 in Europe. So it's an extract of discourse from Emmanuel Macron in the Sorbonne in 2024. So why is it important? European countries are almost all agreed to increase their defense expenditure to up to 5% of the GDP rather than 2% today versus 2% today. And if we do that without coordination, either we will reinforce importation or increase prices. There is tension on production capacities, and we won't solve the problem of material that's lacking or redundant equipment. So I have a first question, Mr. LECORNU. We talk about sovereignty, and at the same time we are seeing all Donald Trump's initiatives in all domains, military, economical. I mean, are we having fun because we can't, we can't impose our French sovereignty, European sovereignty, economic, military sovereignty? No? Yes? Well, I think for the military aspect, we can disconnect it from the rest because, history is not clear. In the 60s, General de Gaulle drawing conclusions from the periods of US isolationism in history and the way the Americans had treated France libre in 44-45, the general observing that the world was being organized between two blocks, it was unacceptable for France not to be sovereign and have the control of its own defense and to have its own nuclear deterrence. And this is where there is a shift. In fact, where do we stand when, and what about the other European countries? Since 1966, 1960s, there is no GI on the French territory. We know we left the nuclear plans of NATO. We're the only nuclear countries of NATO which has its full autonomy. So, and Europe, most of the European countries in Cold War, and even post end of the Varsovie Treaty, well, gave their industry to China, part of the energy model to Russia, and in an obvious way, their security left to Washington, except that the U.S. history, and even George Washington always had time of isolationism. Democrats or Republicans in Washington, well, the two political families, are in a pivotal phase of Europe, which will be of less interest to them increasingly, and they're moving to China and the Pacific. Europe is of no interest for 2 years because they consider that the main security challenge for them is China. Every 4 years, China is launching to sea the equivalent of the full French Navy. So every 4 years. So regardless, we'll come to 3.5% of your time, 5% trade war. It comprises other reality. If I keep to the military aspect, reality it is changing. Democrats would have changed more elegantly, but they would have done it anyway. On va faire 15 minutes. So it's the end of the war with Ukraine. They said they have no stockpile, ammunition, no stockpile. They don't help Ukraine, so we have to rearm ourselves. It would have been the same with Biden. I'm not saying I agree. I'm saying for the last 6 months, the U.S. administration, since mid-January, says we end the military aid package for the Biden administration, and we don't launch any new initiative. We can all look surprised, and I feel sorry about it, and I'll tell you how we could try to solve it, but it's not news. It's not, it's neither to be, weak versus Russia or betraying Ukraine, simply because the U.S. are at a time where they're not egoistic, but first and foremost, they think about their own needs. American stockpiles have been used by Sahel and Israel in all the war actions. So I'm not finding an excuse or being a speaker, but before talking about us, we French and the Europeans, because it's not always between Laurence and I, and even though we belong to the same government with a lot of complicity and friendship, but if we don't agree about the behavior of the US and the fact that the US will not provide the same security to the Europeans, and even tomorrow on the nuclear umbrella, if we don't agree there, everything we'll do will be a mistake. Laurence, now let's talk about the France first and Europe. France. In France, whatever we say, we'll try. Well, there is a military planning expenditure. We want to achieve 67 billion in 2030 or 40, but the budget is limited. We talk, but do we have the means? And many industrialists actually ask themselves, well, we don't see orders, we don't see the money. I think there are several questions in the question. First, there is no free censorship. Whoever moved the budget, when you start doing a budget on March 2nd, orders will be done anyway, don't worry. So what is our relationship with national defense, homeland security, and those who decide to be involved in our own protection? It's the very reason of the state. I was a mayor, I was president of a department. Sometimes, the state did, bicycle line problem, but, a city hall will not buy a nuclear submarine. But we need to have a military apparatus which should be in coherence with what we want to do, which matches our diplomacy. Do we want to be a global power? Do we want to have military might that will allow us to protect our possessions in overseas territories? But, do we have the means? Do we have the means? Do we want to do our own security only and be basically, we shrink back to ourselves, or do want to help ensure the safety of our partners, immediate or overseas departments, but the neighbors of our overseas department or the Gulf countries. So there is nothing worse than to have a military system which is not matching the diplomacy. In 1940, that was the case. We had an offensive diplomacy. If Polos is attacked, we'll go and help the country, but the military system was defensive. You remember the Maginot Line. Last point to put a little political note here. Yeah, I'm amazed about the discussion, social model versus national defense. Well, the resistance and the Gaullists and even the Fourth Republic were able at the same time to repair the military apparatus and to train and define the new social model. And we said we don't buy our weapons in another country, we buy everything in France. So our public expenditures is quite special because we invest. And the investment is always done in France, and therefore we can improve our know-how and jobs, better than jobs. It's a growth driver. 1 franc invested in military tome, clearly it had an impact on our energy system. This is what we need to re-explain in a short-term vision society where the model is poorly known, and we have to explain that again because this defense model makes us different from the other European countries. So how can we make sure that we can actually spread that model? Laurence. I fully agree with Sébastien. Often, we're not chauvinistic. Come on. It is clear that the defense industry creates jobs, and we need to diversify. We diversify using that technology, AI, and it will create even more jobs. Then clearly as well, and Sébastien was saying it, the French defense industry ensures French defense. It is exported not always in Europe. And I'd like first, 2 points. First, Sébastien is right. There is a shift with the other Europeans. We not on the same line. The other Europeans came to the EU to trade. And then once the Berlin Wall and the Soviet bloc fell, they turned to the US for the safety, for the security, not to us. And they always trust the US. Sébastien said there is no US troop on the French territory, but there are more than 100,000 in the rest of the European Union. So, so the others rely on the US, and this is where we have a true, if we face a political situation, even with a renewed Trump administration, which doesn't seem to want to extend the umbrella. Well, there's a trend to buy more American material to make sure the American protection will remain. The second point I'd like to mention and to react to what Sébastien said, and if we want to provide or to ensure the safety of other European states, well, we have to convince them that we can provide them with equipment we provide, but also equipment we'll decide sometime coordinate to choose together. Some European countries never buy French because they don't like it or they want American material. We do a lot, but not enough. But very few other countries do everything. So if we want to do it and we want to optimize the stock of material, we need to get specialized with the European countries. Specialized, it's a bit like the opposite of French army, which is ready, which is able to intervene, in a full-fledged army. We have a full-fledged army, and it is indispensable because nuclear power must have what we call, will be supported by the conventional forces. If you don't have conventional forces, the nuclear threshold will be lower. That was the political trick to justify the budget cuts in the 2000 to say we can hit the wall. We got the deterrence, and therefore we end up in a situation where, when you have to do when we have to give weapons to to Ukraine, or when we want to do other form of defense, we can do it. So the French army was widely used to do only one type of official contract, the anti-terrorist fight. And we realized that not only there is nuclear proliferation, there are spaces which are being challenged, especially maritime space. For example, if 15 years or 20 years ago we'd been told that there would be French frigates in the Red Sea that would fire 10 or after 15 or 30 missiles to stop the Houthis on the who are firing missiles on the French Navy maritime ships. So, basically, we are weak in what is simple. We are weak in what is simple. For a simple reason, when military credits were reduced, what was simple was stop powder, small guns. Today in France, we buy 9mm bullets for the guns of our army. We buy it in foreign countries. It's not Ukraine, it was the COVID that showed that. We realized that we accepted situations which were unacceptable.
So we've got to reindustrialize, we've got to relocate. This is what we're seeing here under the tent. As it's simple, the sector is highly competitive. Today, the difference of the Cold War, Israel, Turkey, India, all these countries that are developing defense technology and that are competing. The second segment where we might be weak, where we haven't yet let go, is endurance. Where we've got endurance, it's all of the technological bricks that don't exist. I'm not talking about high technology that doesn't yet exist. Our deterrence is pulling us upwards for many aspects: aerospace, maritime, electronic systems. But the new bricks, the new breakthroughs, I should say, artificial intelligence, new space, and quantum physics. Everybody's talking about AI. The quantum revolution in terms of military aspects will be all the more unsettling and brutal as artificial intelligence. And that's where Laurence is right. Let's not reinvent the wheel or reinvent powder. We're not going to be developing a spatial program like Ariane alone. That doesn't make sense. We have to share the bill. We've got to pool everything. And it's clear that for some objects, pooling is possible. Not like for Ariane, it might be complicated, but drawing inspiration from that with countries that want to. I don't believe in communitarism. I don't believe in, the European Commission managing everything. What about bilateral agreements, alliances? Yes, we've got client countries with client armies saying we might have the same needs, so let's have specifications. But that's not just European, Look what we're doing with India, with the United Arab Emirates. Countries that don't want to depend on Washington or Peking or Moscow, they've got to be self-centered to consider just France. It's the case of most Gulf countries. They've bought American fighter planes. Sometimes they didn't even start when they put the key in the ignition because, everything remains under American control. So it's the same thing for the countries in the Indo-Pacific area. Indonesia might become a huge Rafale country because they want to buy French, not Russian, not Chinese, not American. And that's something that will help our independence and something that we need to focus on in the coming years. So that's the path towards political sovereignty, European, not political in the direct sense of the term, but European and military. Yes. This is what Sébastien was saying. It's what I was saying as well. We need a certain amount of coordination. We can't have an army, a complete small army in France under the control. And if Sébastien will correct me, it's the head of the army who says, oh, Russia will last out 5 minutes more. And then we can't provide European security or French security if all of the countries weren't able also to ensure their own security. Let me just take a side step with respect to what Sébastien said. It's really important not to oppose defense and social aspects. If we oppose the two, it's what the Russians do. It's what our enemies are doing. They distribute, they spread that word. They say, look, we're investing in defense when we don't really need to. That will antagonize everybody. That will bring defence and growth together, and that will weaken things politically. So that's why we need to work with others. We need to produce more and faster at greater scale and at a lesser cost. So Sébastien LECORNU, you're saying we're moving towards that sovereignty in reality, that we're progressing. We're having debates, we've got projects that will allow us to really reach sovereignty. Yes, you've got to cut the problem up into little bits. So when you ask the question, why aren't European countries buying Rafales? Well, a Rafale, it doesn't bring us an American nuclear bomb. Let's say things the way they are. Let's not beat around the bush. It's only the F-35 that brings the American nuclear bomb and to access to American protection. They don't sell Rafales to countries that don't have that nuclear protection. But there are lots of European countries, not all of them. Unfortunately, they are part of a minority, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know. But I think that there are other segments where we have to move forward. I believe in technological bricks. Weapon systems, we're looking at different pieces of a puzzle. Should we pay everything alone at all costs when technological bricks might be shared? Objectively, that's the question. And the second question, and this is what we saw with Ukraine, it's terrible. We're all members of the same alliance, and we have been since the 60s, so NATO, that wants things to be interoperable. So it's a French artillery system can be deployed into a battlefield, and it has to be able to interact, obviously, with the German shielded cavalry. Now, since the disintegration of the Warsaw Pact, we've got standard specifications, and so that's an obstacle for defence. Who has an army per country? I'm for that, but these neighbouring armies, if they're not capable of carrying out shared operations, then that would be a step back, because during the Cold War, this is what we did. Now, my wish, it's a wish to be pragmatic. We need to be able to do what we could do during the Cold War. And secondly, like the Ariane model, everything that brings the cost down for the French taxpayer without damaging our sovereignty. There will be things that we share. There are other things that we won't share. And I think that will work. So we've got to create that kind of shock. This is what the president said at the Sorbonne, but things need to be streamlined. So it's the art of execution that can be quite difficult. If we're in a country where what our armies are asking is more important than what industrialists can do. But at the end of the day, the specifications of the Rafale, it's not for mass sports, it's for a nuclear war. So that's what makes the Rafale a success or a failure, is because we can do that. So what industrialists who are important want, they want army models. And most European countries want domestic security. For 10 years, we fought against terrorism in the Sahel, but we're all the Americans of someone. We fought against terrorism in Sahel, in Africa, more or less alone, and for all Europeans. But things are changing. Look at the Germans. They're beginning to do things. They're increasing their budget. They've even talked about nuclear bombs. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done. The Polish buy American, the Finns, they buy American, the Polish buy South Korean. And as long as we don't have Europeans buying European, we'll have a problem. And as long as we're producing, I think it's 14 types of tanks on the European continent, and this is what happened with the help to Ukraine. We need to talk to each other. And again, if we want to focus on our efforts on growth and employment and not to have social impacts, which is possible. Germany is reconverting its automotive industries into military industries, possibly. And as long as we don't do things like this, I think, we'll still wonder how things will be. So we've got when will things become more fluid? When? So our defense industry also needs to evolve. And as we've been delayed, I didn't use many figures, but since 2017, it's 240 billion euros of orders that have been sent into the French industry between 2010 and 2017, 145. So this is unparalleled. So what is the real subject? Well, it's an industry that is involved in small series high technology. So some of our civil industrialists, the automotive industry, they're involved in mass series production. Now, and that's why it's important to focus on supply chains. Why are we not producing fast enough? Often because the supply chain can't follow on. So there needs to be a pooling and exchange. Production based on licensing as well. So European countries are buying Americans because the Americans are saying, okay, we'll set up a factory in Germany, we'll give you a license, and you can use German employees. And that helps to sell the arms, the weapons. And our industries, and I'm saying this very firmly, we need to be capable of adapting to the European market. And it's not the same market as you have in the Gulf or the Pacific. So we need to propose the same operational model as the Americans. Yes, the reality is that we can't disconnect our defense industries from our military system. So that's the mother of all battles. That's what we need to do for our own security. We've got to have an industrial fabric that is able to meet our own needs. Otherwise, there won't be any group security. I have one last current question, because the defense budget will be voted next week, the army budget. Is it next week? Yes, well, you'll hear about it next week. No, just one word. There's a gentleman who's waving a fanal, and it's a sign saying that the time is up. So we need to look at the reality of the threats weighing down on a country. They are different, they're not all serious, but they're all hybrid. Cyber attacks, information attacks, nuclear powers. So new military spaces, this under the sea, for example. These are subjects that have to be treated. We need to invest. We need to constantly adapt our defense apparatus. There can be different types of threats. There's the Ukraine, we've seen it there, and the Middle East. So there we are. So that's what we need to hear. Thank you very much to the both of you. So we've overstepped the time, but it really was very exciting. Thank you.